Chapter 1. Ghosts of War. Douglas Lacey had killed 17 men in his lifetime, each death meticulously calculated and executed without remorse. After 15 years in military black operations, his hands were steady, his conscience clear, and his loyalty absolute. The mountain villages of Eastern Europe had been his home for the past 8 months, hunting down war criminals who thought they could hide from American justice. The mission had been classified beyond top secret, eliminating a network of human traffickers who had been selling American intelligence to hostile nations. Douglas had spent months infiltrating their organization, speaking fluent Serbian and Romanian, becoming one of them. When the time came, he'd systematically dismantled the entire network from within, leaving no survivors except for the information they'd extracted. At 42, Douglas was a machine built for war. His 6'3" frame carried not an ounce of excess weight, every muscle honed for violence. His steel-gray eyes had seen horrors that would break lesser men, and his weathered face bore scars that told stories he could never share. He'd married Rose Stevens 12 years ago, drawn to her warmth and seeming innocence, qualities he'd thought would balance his darkness. Their daughter Holly had been 10 when he'd left for this mission. Now she was 11, and he'd missed her birthday, her school play, and countless bedtime stories. But that was the price of keeping America safe. Rose understood this, or so he believed. The flight from Bucharest to Denver International Airport gave him 18 hours to decompress, to shift from predator back to husband and father. He'd done this transition dozens of times before, but something felt different this time. Rose's video calls had become infrequent, and when they did talk, she seemed distant, distracted. He'd attributed it to the strain of single parenting, but his instincts, the same ones that had kept him alive in hostile territory, whispered that something was wrong. Douglas had learned to trust his instincts above all else. The plane touched down at 3:47 p.m. on a crisp October afternoon. No one was there to meet him, another red flag. Rose always picked him up from missions, usually with Holly bouncing excitedly in the passenger seat. Instead, he caught a cab to their home in the affluent suburb of Greenwood Village, watching familiar neighborhoods pass by the window. Their 2-story colonial house sat on a quiet cul-de-sac, white picket fence and manicured lawn painting the picture of American suburban perfection. Douglas paid the driver and shouldered his single duffel bag. Everything he'd needed for 8 months of hell fit into one bag. That was how operators lived. Light, mobile, ready. He used his key to enter through the front door, expecting to hear Holly's voice calling Daddy, or Rose rushing to embrace him. Instead, silence greeted him. The house felt different, colder somehow. Pictures had been rearranged, and he noticed some of his belongings were missing from their usual places. Rose? Holly. His voice echoed through the empty house. A manila envelope sat prominently on the kitchen counter, his name written across it in Rose's careful handwriting. Douglas set down his bag and opened it with steady hands, though his pulse began to quicken. Divorce papers. Meticulously prepared, dated 3 weeks ago. The grounds listed: irreconcilable differences and emotional abandonment. His wife of 12 years wanted half of everything, full custody of Holly, and alimony that would cripple him financially. But it was the handwritten note paperclipped to the legal documents that made his blood run cold. Douglas, I can't live this lie anymore. Holly and I deserve better than a ghost for a husband and father. Kenneth Richmond has shown me what real love looks like. We're starting over. Don't try to find us. Rose. Kenneth Richmond. Douglas knew that name. Richmond was a successful defense attorney, 45 years old, recently divorced himself. More importantly, he was Gregory Stevens' business partner, Gregory being Rose's father and Douglas's former father-in-law. Douglas had never liked Gregory Stevens. The man was wealthy, influential, and had never approved of his daughter marrying a government thug, as he'd once called Douglas at a family dinner. Gregory owned a chain of luxury car dealerships and had always made it clear he thought Rose had married beneath her station. Now, apparently, Kenneth Richmond represented a suitable upgrade. Douglas felt something cold and familiar settling in his chest, the same deadly calm that came over him during missions. His wife hadn't just left him. She'd humiliated him, stolen his daughter, and aligned herself with people who had never respected what he sacrificed for his country. He walked through the house methodically, cataloging what was missing. Rose's clothes, jewelry, and personal items were gone. Holly's room had been stripped of her favorite belongings. They'd been planning this for weeks, maybe months, while he'd been risking his life in foreign mountains. The betrayal cut deeper than any wound he'd received in combat. Douglas returned to the kitchen and read the divorce papers more carefully. The filing date was 2 weeks after he'd left for his mission. Rose had waited just long enough to ensure he'd be unreachable, unable to contest or fight back. The legal maneuvers were sophisticated, clearly guided by Richmond's expertise. They thought they were dealing with a simple soldier, a man who could be outmaneuvered by lawyers and legal procedures. They had no idea what they'd just declared war against. Douglas Lacey had toppled governments, eliminated terrorist cells, and survived in hostile territory for months at a time. His wife and her lawyer lover had just made the gravest tactical error of their lives. He picked up his secure satellite phone and dialed a number from memory. "Donnelly here," came the gruff voice of his handler. "Todd, it's Douglas. I need you to run a full background check on Kenneth Richmond, attorney, Denver area. Everything, finances, associates, habits, weaknesses. I also need surveillance on my wife Rose and daughter Holly. Doug, you just got back. Take some leave, decompress. This isn't a request, Todd. Someone's made this personal." There was a pause. Todd Donnelly had been running Black Ops for 20 years and knew better than to argue with an operator in Douglas's frame of mind. "I'll have everything by morning. Doug, be smart about this." Douglas ended the call and walked to his study. Behind a false panel in his desk, he retrieved several items his wife didn't know existed. 3 different passports, $50,000 in cash, and a list of contacts who could provide anything from weapons to untraceable vehicles. Rose Stevens Lacey thought she was divorcing a simple soldier. Instead, she'd just awakened something far more dangerous, a predator with unlimited resources and nothing left to lose. The war had come home. Chapter 2, The Trap Springs. Douglas spent the night in his empty house, not sleeping but planning. By dawn, he had a preliminary strategy forming. His phone buzzed at 6:15 a.m. with an encrypted message from Todd Donnelly. "Package delivered. Check your email." The background report on Kenneth Richmond was thorough and revealing. Richmond was indeed successful, worth approximately $4.2 million, with a reputation for handling high-profile divorces for wealthy clients. More interesting was his partnership with Gregory Stevens in several real estate ventures beyond the car dealerships. The two men had been friends for over 20 years. What caught Douglas's attention was a pattern in Richmond's cases. He specialized in representing wives of military personnel, particularly those deployed overseas. In the past 5 years, he'd handled 17 such divorces, always ensuring maximum financial damage to the returning servicemen. It was a lucrative niche, and apparently, Rose was just his latest conquest. The surveillance photos made Douglas's jaw clench. Rose and Richmond were staying at the Broadmoor Resort in Colorado Springs with Holly. The images showed them acting like a family. Richmond pushing Holly on swings, Rose laughing at dinner, all of them looking perfectly content while Douglas's world burned. Douglas was studying the photos when his doorbell rang at 8:30 a.m. Through the peephole, he saw 2 Denver police detectives on his porch. This wasn't about the divorce papers. He opened the door with the casual confidence of someone with nothing to hide. "Gentlemen, Douglas Lacey?" The older detective, a tired-looking man in his 50s, held up his badge. "I'm Detective Shane Bartlett. This is Detective Wayne Dudley. We need to ask you some questions about Gregory Stevens." "Gregory's my father-in-law." "What about him? When did you last see Mr. Stevens?" Douglas's mind raced through possibilities. "About 8 months ago, before I left on a business trip." "Why? Has something happened?" "Mr. Stevens was found dead in his office yesterday evening. Single gunshot to the head. We're investigating it as a homicide." Douglas felt the walls of a trap closing around him, but his expression remained neutral. "I'm sorry to hear that. Gregory and I weren't close, but he was Holly's grandfather." "Where were you yesterday evening, Mr. Lacey?" "Flying back from Romania. I can provide flight records, passport stamps, whatever you need." Douglas reached slowly for his wallet, producing his passport. "I landed at DIA at 3:47 p.m. Detective Bartlett examined the passport while Dudley watched Douglas carefully. "This shows you arriving yesterday, but it doesn't account for earlier movements. How long were you out of the country?" 8 months. Continuous deployment." Douglas provided his military contact information. You can verify my location through official channels. The detectives exchanged glances. Something was off about their approach. They were fishing, not investigating a legitimate lead. Mr. Lacey, we understand you've had some domestic difficulties recently, Detective Dudley said carefully. My wife filed for divorce while I was overseas, if that's what you mean. I only discovered it yesterday when I got home. According to Mrs. Lacey, you've made threats against her father in the past. Specifically, that you'd make him pay for interfering in your marriage. Douglas felt the shape of the conspiracy becoming clear. This wasn't random timing. Gregory Stevens' murder was connected to his divorce, and someone was orchestrating events to frame him. Detective, I've been out of the country for 8 months. I can prove my location every single day through military records. If someone killed Gregory Stevens, they did it while I was 3,000 miles away. We'll need to verify that, Bartlett said. In the meantime, we need you to come to the station for formal questioning. Am I under arrest? Not at this time, but we strongly advise cooperation. Douglas nodded, his mind already working through the implications. Someone had murdered Gregory Stevens and was attempting to frame him for it. The timing with the divorce papers was too perfect to be coincidental. This was a coordinated attack designed to destroy him personally and legally. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They were playing a short game against someone trained in long-term strategy. I'll follow you to the station, Douglas said. I want this cleared up as much as you do. 3 hours later, Douglas sat in an interrogation room while detectives Bartlett and Dudley pressed him about his relationship with Gregory Stevens. The questions were predictable, clearly coached by someone familiar with his background. Your father-in-law opposed your marriage to his daughter, correct? Gregory made his feelings known, yes. He thought you were unsuitable for Rose? He preferred men who wore suits instead of uniforms. Did that make you angry, Mr. Lacey? Douglas leaned back in his chair, studying the detectives. They were competent cops, but they were being fed information by someone else. Gentlemen, let me save us all some time. Someone murdered Gregory Stevens and is trying to frame me for it. They chose yesterday specifically because they knew I'd be returning from deployment and would be emotionally vulnerable after discovering the divorce papers. They're counting on you to arrest me based on circumstantial evidence and motive. Detective Bartlett frowned. That's a serious accusation. It's the only explanation that fits the facts. I suggest you look at who benefits from Gregory's death and my imprisonment. I'm guessing it's not a coincidence that the main beneficiary of Gregory's will is his daughter Rose, who's now romantically involved with Kenneth Richmond. Are you suggesting Mrs. Lacey was involved in her father's murder? Douglas smiled coldly. I'm suggesting you investigate who had access to Gregory yesterday, who knew about my return date, and who's been planning this divorce for months. The answers might surprise you. The detectives left him alone for 20 minutes, long enough for Douglas to activate a small device hidden in his watch. Military-grade technology that his handlers didn't know he'd kept. It would record everything said in the room and transmit it to a secure server. When they returned, Detective Dudley looked uncomfortable. Mr. Lacey, we verified your travel records. You were definitely out of the country when Mr. Stevens was killed. However, Bartlett added, there's been a development. We have a witness who claims you approached them about harming Gregory Stevens before you left on deployment. Douglas felt his pulse quicken slightly. What witness? Holly Lacey. Your daughter. The words hit him like a physical blow. They'd turned his own daughter against him. Holly is 11 years old, Douglas said quietly. Whatever she's been told to say, she's been coached. She's very articulate for her age, Dudley replied. She says you told her you were going to take care of Grandpa Gregory before you left. Douglas closed his eyes, understanding the full scope of the trap. They hadn't just stolen his wife and framed him for murder. They'd weaponized his own child against him. When he opened his eyes, both detectives unconsciously leaned back. Something predatory had awakened in Douglas Lacey's face. I want to call my lawyer, he said. But he wasn't planning to call a lawyer. He was planning to call in every favor, every contact, and every resource he'd accumulated in 15 years of black operations. Someone had declared war on his family, his freedom, and his life. They were about to learn why Douglas Lacey had never lost a mission. Chapter 3. The Courtroom Revelation. 3 weeks later, Douglas sat in the defendant's chair of Judge Edwin Foley's courtroom, studying the faces of the people who had betrayed him. Rose sat in the gallery behind the prosecution table, elegant in a black dress that suggested mourning for her father, while simultaneously flattering her figure for Richmond, who sat beside her with a proprietary hand on her shoulder. Holly occupied the witness stand, looking small and nervous in her Sunday dress. She'd grown taller in the months he'd been away, her blonde hair longer now, her face more mature. But her blue eyes, his eyes, refused to meet his gaze. District Attorney Marilyn Porter stood before the jury, painting Douglas as a dangerous, violent man who'd murdered his father-in-law in a fit of rage over the divorce. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Motive, opportunity. They claimed he'd secretly returned to the country, and now his daughter's testimony. Holly, D.A. Porter said gently, I know this is difficult, but can you tell the court what your father said to you before he left on his last trip? Holly's voice was barely audible. He said Grandpa Gregory was causing problems for our family. Did he say anything else about your grandfather? Holly glanced quickly at her mother, then at Richmond. He said he was going to take care of the problem when he got back. Douglas watched his daughter's face carefully. She was lying, not just to the court, but to herself. Someone had convinced her that testifying against him was the right thing to do. The prosecution rested after 2 days of testimony. Douglas's court-appointed attorney, Barry Cameron, was competent but outmatched by the resources arrayed against them. The case looked hopeless. But Douglas had spent 3 weeks preparing for this moment. Your Honor, he said, standing suddenly. I'd like to exercise my right to represent myself. Judge Foley frowned. Mr. Lacey, I strongly advise against that. This is a capital murder case. I understand, Your Honor, but I have evidence that my current counsel is not equipped to present. After 20 minutes of legal arguments, Judge Foley reluctantly granted Douglas's request. Barry Cameron gathered his papers with obvious relief. He'd been expecting to lose anyway. Douglas approached the bench with a single manila folder. Your Honor, I call Gregory Stevens to the stand. The courtroom erupted in confusion. D.A. Porter jumped to her feet. Your Honor, this is obviously impossible. Mr. Stevens is the victim. I'm not calling the victim, Your Honor. I'm calling the man who's been hiding in a military safe house for the past month. Judge Foley's eyes widened as the courtroom doors opened. 2 men in military uniforms escorted a very much alive Gregory Stevens into the courtroom. Rose screamed and collapsed into Richmond's arms. Holly stared in shock at her supposedly dead grandfather. Ladies and gentlemen, Douglas said, his voice carrying clearly through the chaos. Meet the murder victim, who's been cooperating with military intelligence to expose a conspiracy against a federal agent. D.A. Porter was shouting objections, but Judge Foley was studying the documents Douglas had placed before him. After a moment, the judge's face went pale. Bailiff, clear the gallery. Seal the courtroom. No one enters or leaves without my permission. Your Honor, Porter protested. This is highly irregular. Miss Porter, I suggest you sit down and be quiet. You're about to learn why. Judge Foley looked at Douglas. Proceed, Mr. Lacey. Douglas turned to face the courtroom as bailiffs moved to seal the doors. Your Honor, 3 weeks ago I returned from a classified military operation to find divorce papers and a murder charge waiting for me. At first, I thought I was the victim of an elaborate setup. I was wrong. He opened his folder and removed a photograph. This is a surveillance photo taken 18 months ago in Bucharest, Romania. It shows Kenneth Richmond meeting with a man named Viktor Kozlov, a Russian intelligence asset, who was selling American military secrets. Richmond shot to his feet. This is preposterous. Your Honor, this man is obviously delusional. Mr. Richmond, Judge Foley said coldly, you're not representing anyone in this courtroom. Sit down. Douglas continued. For the past 8 months, I wasn't just hunting war criminals in Eastern Europe. I was investigating how classified information about American black operations was being leaked to hostile nations. The trail led to a network of people here in Denver who were selling intelligence to foreign buyers. He placed another document on the judge's bench. This is a recording of Kenneth Richmond providing details about my mission timeline to Russian assets. He knew exactly when I'd be returning, and he orchestrated both the divorce and the fake murder to ensure I'd be imprisoned and unable to expose his treason. Gregory Stevens took the witness stand, looking appropriately shaken but very much alive. Your Honor, when Douglas contacted me 3 weeks ago and explained what was happening, I agreed to fake my death to draw out the real conspiracy. My daughter and Kenneth had been planning to take control of my assets while setting up Douglas for murder. Rose was sobbing hysterically while Richmond had gone dead pale. But Douglas wasn't finished. "Holly," he said, addressing his daughter directly for the first time. "Come here." The girl climbed down from the witness stand and approached her father uncertainly. Douglas knelt to her eye level. "Sweetheart, did Mommy and Mr. Richmond tell you that Daddy was a bad man who hurt people?" Holly nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Did they tell you that lying about Daddy was the only way to keep you safe?" Another nod. Douglas gently wiped her tears. "Holly, Daddy's job is to stop bad people from hurting America. Mommy and Mr. Richmond are the bad people. They were selling secrets to our enemies." "But Mommy said." "Mommy lied, sweetheart. And she taught you to lie too. But it's not your fault." Douglas stood and faced the judge. "Your Honor, I have documented evidence of Kenneth Richmond's treason, my wife's knowing participation in espionage activities, and their conspiracy to commit murder. They didn't fake my father-in-law's death out of mercy. They fully intended to kill him after I was convicted, making Rose the sole heir to his fortune." Judge Foley was reading through the documents with growing alarm. "Mr. Lacey, these are federal charges. This court doesn't have jurisdiction." The courtroom doors opened despite being sealed. Military police entered, led by Colonel Todd Donnelly in full-dress uniform. "Your Honor," Donnelly announced, "by order of the Department of Defense and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, I'm taking custody of Kenneth Richmond and Rose Lacey for charges of espionage, treason, and conspiracy to commit murder." Richmond tried to run but was tackled by military police before he reached the exit. Rose could only stare in shock as handcuffs were placed on her wrists. Douglas watched with cold satisfaction as his wife was led away. She looked back at him once, her face a mixture of terror and disbelief. "Douglas," she called out desperately, "I'm sorry. They made me do it. Please." Douglas didn't reply. His wife had betrayed her country, stolen his daughter, and tried to destroy his life. There would be no forgiveness, no mercy, no second chances. Holly tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy? What's going to happen to Mommy?" Douglas picked up his daughter, feeling her small arms wrap around his neck. "Mommy made very bad choices, sweetheart. She's going to have to face the consequences." Judge Foley dismissed all charges against Douglas and ordered the courtroom sealed pending federal investigation. As the gallery emptied, Douglas found himself alone with Holly and Gregory. "I'm sorry, Douglas," Gregory said quietly. "I never knew what Rose was involved in. When you contacted me and explained everything, you did the right thing," Douglas replied. "But understand this, Gregory, your daughter is going to prison for the rest of her life. She chose treason over family." Gregory nodded sadly. "What about Holly?" Douglas looked down at his daughter, who had fallen asleep in his arms, exhausted by the trauma of the day. "Holly is innocent. She was manipulated by people she trusted. But she's my daughter, and I'll protect her from now on. Will you be able to forgive her for testifying against you?" Douglas's expression darkened. "Holly is 11 years old and was coached to lie by adults she trusted. That's not betrayal. That's abuse. But Rose knew exactly what she was doing when she chose Richmond over her family and country. And you'll never forgive her." "Forgiveness is for accidents and mistakes," Douglas said coldly. "Rose committed deliberate treason. She collaborated with foreign enemies and used our daughter as a weapon against me. That's not something you forgive. That's something you ensure never happens again." As they walked out of the courthouse, Douglas Lacey carried his sleeping daughter toward a future that would be built on truth instead of lies, justice instead of betrayal. Behind them, the legal machinery of a nation at war with traitors began its inexorable work. Rose Stevens Lacey and Kenneth Richmond would spend the rest of their lives paying for their choices. Douglas Lacey, trained killer and protector of America, would ensure they were never forgotten and never forgiven. The mission was complete. Justice was served. The war was won. Chapter 4, Buried Secrets. 6 months after the courtroom revelation, Douglas sat in his study reviewing classified reports while Holly did her homework at the kitchen table. Their life had settled into a routine of sorts, though the ghosts of betrayal still haunted every quiet moment. Rose and Richmond were being held in federal detention while prosecutors built their espionage cases. The evidence Douglas had provided was devastating. 18 months of recorded conversations, financial records showing payments from Russian intelligence, and documentation of classified information being systematically leaked through Richmond's law practice. But Douglas knew there were deeper layers to uncover. "Daddy." Holly appeared in his doorway, looking uncertain. "Can we talk?" Douglas immediately closed his laptop and gestured to the chair across from his desk. At 12 now, Holly had grown more thoughtful and serious than any child should be. The weight of learning that her mother was a traitor had fundamentally changed her. "What's on your mind, sweetheart?" "I remember things," Holly said quietly. "Things from before you came back. Things that didn't make sense then, but do now." Douglas felt his pulse quicken. "What kind of things?" "Mommy had meetings at the house when you were gone. With Mr. Richmond, but also with other people. Foreign people. They spoke different languages sometimes." This was new information. Douglas had known about Richmond's treason, but the scope of the conspiracy might be larger than he'd realized. "Can you describe these people?" Holly closed her eyes, concentrating. "There was a woman with an accent. Russian, I think. She had short dark hair and always wore expensive clothes. She came 3 times that I saw. And there was a man with gray hair who spoke Spanish with an accent. He seemed important. Everyone listened to him when he talked." Douglas made mental notes. Russian intelligence typically used women for long-term infiltration operations, and the Spanish speaker suggested connections to Latin American networks. "Holly, this is very important. Did you ever see them exchange anything? Papers, computers, anything like that?" "Once," Holly said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I wasn't supposed to see, but I came downstairs for water. The Russian woman gave Mommy a small computer. Mommy put it in her jewelry box upstairs." Douglas felt a chill run down his spine. Rose's personal effects had been seized by federal agents. But if they hadn't known to look for hidden electronics? "Sweetheart, you've been very brave telling me this. But I need you to understand something. What your mother did wasn't just wrong. It was dangerous to our entire country. The people she was working with are enemies of America." Holly nodded solemnly. "I know, Daddy. That's why I'm telling you now. I was scared before, but I trust you more than I was scared." Douglas felt a surge of fierce protectiveness. His daughter had been through hell, but she was choosing truth over fear. She was stronger than either of her parents had given her credit for. "There's something else," Holly continued. "Grandpa Gregory wasn't just pretending to be dead for your plan, was he?" Douglas studied his daughter's face. She was too intelligent to accept simple explanations anymore. "What makes you say that?" "Because he's been different since the trial. Quieter. And he doesn't look at me the same way." Holly paused. "He's scared of something." Douglas had noticed the same thing. Gregory had been helpful during the investigation, but something about his behavior suggested he knew more than he'd revealed. "Holly, I want you to stay with your friend Megan Shea's family this weekend. I have some work to do." "Is it dangerous work?" Douglas looked at his daughter, really looked at her. She'd lost her innocence, but she'd gained something more valuable, the ability to see truth clearly. "It might be," he said honestly. "But that's what I do, sweetheart. I find dangerous people and stop them from hurting others." That evening, after dropping Holly at the Shea house, Douglas drove to Gregory's mansion in Cherry Hills Village. The house was dark except for a single light in Gregory's study. Douglas used skills learned in hostile territory to enter without triggering the security system. He found Gregory sitting behind his desk, staring at a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. "Hello, Gregory." The older man didn't startle. He'd been expecting this visit. "Douglas, I wondered when you'd come." Holly remembers things. Foreign visitors. A Russian woman. A computer hidden in Rose's jewelry box. Gregory's shoulders sagged. She was always too smart for her own good. Douglas moved closer, his presence filling the room like a predator scenting weakness. "What aren't you telling me, Gregory?" "It wasn't just Rose and Richmond," Gregory said finally. "The network was bigger. Much bigger." "How much bigger?" Gregory reached into his desk drawer slowly, producing a thick folder. "I've been documenting everything for months, trying to find a way out. But they made it clear, cooperation meant Holly and I lived. Resistance meant we disappeared." Douglas took the folder and began reading. What he found made his blood run cold. The espionage network included 12 prominent Denver attorneys, 6 city officials, 3 federal judges, and a network of business leaders who'd been feeding classified information to foreign intelligence services for over 3 years. Rose's involvement had been just one small part of a massive operation designed to infiltrate American legal and political systems. Why didn't you come to me sooner? Because, Gregory said quietly, I thought Rose could be saved. I thought if I played along, kept track of everything, maybe when you returned we could find a way to protect her. You chose your daughter over your country. Gregory met Douglas's eyes for the first time. Wouldn't you choose Holly over anything? The question hung in the air between them. Douglas understood the impulse, but he also understood the consequences. The difference, Gregory, is that I would never put Holly in a position where she had to choose between her family and her country. Rose made that choice herself. Douglas continued reading through the files. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Foreign intelligence services had systematically targeted the families of military personnel, using divorce proceedings to gain access to classified information and turn loyal Americans into unwitting assets. They're still out there, Gregory said. The arrests of Rose and Richmond were just the beginning. The rest of the network is still operating. Douglas closed the folder and looked at Gregory with new understanding. That's why you've been scared. They know you helped expose Rose and Richmond. They've made it clear that my cooperation ends the moment I'm no longer useful. And Holly is my responsibility now, Douglas said firmly. But you're going to help me finish this. Gregory looked up with surprise. What do you mean? Douglas smiled, and Gregory saw something in that expression that reminded him why his son-in-law had been chosen for black operations. I mean, we're going to dismantle this entire network. Every lawyer, every judge, every businessman who sold out their country. And we're going to do it in a way that ensures they can never threaten another military family. Douglas, these people are connected at the highest levels of government. They have resources, protection. So do I, Douglas interrupted. And unlike them, I don't have anything left to lose. He stood and walked toward the door, then paused. Gregory, you made a mistake trusting Rose over me. But you chose correctly when it mattered. That's the only reason Holly still has a grandfather. What happens to me when this is over? Douglas turned back, his expression unreadable. That depends on how useful you are in destroying the people who threaten my daughter. As Douglas left the mansion, his mind was already working through the tactical implications of what he'd learned. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about national security. And Douglas Lacey had just declared war on a conspiracy that had been operating in the shadows for years. They'd made the mistake of targeting his family. Now they were going to learn what happened when you gave a black operations specialist a personal mission with unlimited scope for violence. The real war was just beginning. Chapter 5. The Network Exposed. 2 weeks later, Douglas sat in a secure conference room at Peterson Air Force Base, surrounded by federal agents, military intelligence officers, and Justice Department prosecutors. The evidence Gregory had provided had opened a Pandora's box of corruption that reached into the highest levels of Colorado's legal and political establishment. Gentlemen, said Agent Luz Myers from the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, what we're looking at is the most sophisticated foreign intelligence operation ever discovered on American soil. 12 defense attorneys, 6 municipal officials, 3 federal judges, and at least 20 prominent businessmen have been systematically compromised. Colonel Donnelly leaned forward. How long has this been operating? Based on the financial records, at least 4 years. Possibly longer. Myers clicked through a presentation showing the network structure. They targeted military families specifically, using divorce proceedings to gain access to classified information. The pattern is clear. Deploy the serviceman overseas, seduce the wife, initiate divorce proceedings, and extract intelligence during the legal discovery process. Douglas studied the photographs of the conspirators. Many were faces he recognized from Denver society events, charity galas, and political fundraisers. Respectable people who'd sold their country for money and influence. What's the scope of the intelligence breach? Asked Justice Department Prosecutor Nellie Erickson. Catastrophic, Donnelly replied grimly. Troop movements, operational security protocols, personnel files for hundreds of special operations personnel. 3 ongoing missions were compromised, resulting in the deaths of American soldiers. The room fell silent. Douglas felt the familiar cold rage settling over him. The same feeling he'd had when facing enemy combatants who'd killed his brothers in arms. I want them all, he said quietly. Agent Myers looked at him with concern. Mr. Lacey, we understand your personal investment in this case, but You misunderstand, Douglas interrupted. I'm not asking for permission. I'm telling you what's going to happen. These people killed American soldiers and threatened my daughter. They're going to pay for that. Mr. Lacey, Prosecutor Erickson said carefully, we have to follow legal procedures. Gather evidence, obtain warrants, build prosecutable cases. Legal procedures didn't stop them from committing treason, Douglas replied. And legal procedures won't prevent them from destroying evidence or fleeing the country while you build your cases. Colonel Donnelly recognized the look in Douglas's eyes. What are you proposing? Douglas opened his laptop and connected it to the room's display system. I'm proposing we use the same tactics they used against military families. We turn them against each other. The screen showed a detailed network analysis of the conspiracy, with connections mapped between all the participants. Douglas had spent 2 weeks building this intelligence picture, using resources from his Black Operations contacts. Kenneth Richmond was the central coordinator, but he wasn't the leader. The real leadership comes from here. Douglas highlighted 3 names: Judge Wayne Dudley, Attorney Julio Simmons, and businessman Everett Page. These 3 have been running the operation since its inception. They recruited the other participants, managed the foreign contacts, and distributed the payments. More importantly, they're the only ones who know the full scope of the network. Agent Myers studied the diagram. How do you know this? Because I've been watching them for 2 weeks. Surveillance, electronic monitoring, financial tracking. They're panicking since Rose and Richmond's arrest, and panic makes people careless. Douglas clicked to the next slide, showing photographs and audio transcripts. Judge Dudley has been meeting secretly with foreign contacts, trying to arrange extraction routes. Attorney Simmons has been systematically destroying evidence and attempting to silence other network members. And Everett Page has been transferring money to offshore accounts. This is all inadmissible, Prosecutor Erickson protested. Obtained without warrants. I'm not a law enforcement officer, Douglas said calmly. I'm a private citizen conducting legal surveillance on public figures. And everything I've gathered points to an imminent threat to national security. Colonel Donnelly was studying the intelligence reports with growing interest. What kind of threat? They're planning to eliminate loose ends, starting with Gregory Stevens and Holly. The room went deadly quiet. Douglas continued with cold precision. Gregory's cooperation exposed the network, and Holly can identify foreign operatives who visited our house. They see them as liabilities that need to be removed. We can provide protection, Agent Myers began. Protection failed to stop them from infiltrating our legal system for 4 years. Douglas cut her off. Protection isn't going to stop a network with this many resources and connections. Douglas switched to another slide showing detailed operational plans. But elimination will. We're going to systematically dismantle this network using their own methods against them. Legal pressure, financial leverage, and targeted elimination of key personnel. Mr. Lacey, Prosecutor Erickson said firmly, we cannot sanction assassination of American citizens. I'm not talking about assassination, Douglas replied. I'm talking about justice. These people have committed treason during wartime. The penalties for that are clear. Colonel Donnelly leaned back in his chair. What do you need from us? Agent Myers looked shocked. Colonel, we can't just authorize. Agent Myers, Donnelly interrupted. 3 of my soldiers are dead because of these people. Mr. Lacey has provided more actionable intelligence in 2 weeks than our official investigations have gathered in 6 months. I'm inclined to give him the resources he needs. Douglas felt the familiar satisfaction of a mission coming together. I need official cover for surveillance operations, access to military intelligence databases, and coordination with federal prosecutors for the arrests. And unofficially? Donnelly asked. Douglas's smile was predatory. Unofficially, I need these people to understand that betraying their country has consequences that extend beyond prison sentences. Over the next hour, they hammered out the details of a coordinated operation to take down the entire network. Federal agents would handle the legal aspects while Douglas provided intelligence and tactical support. But Douglas had his own plans that went beyond what he'd shared with the federal task force. These people had killed his brothers in arms and threatened his daughter. Legal justice was necessary, but it wasn't sufficient. They needed to understand that some betrayals carried penalties that no court could impose. Douglas Lacey was about to remind them why Black Operations specialists were never fully retired from service. The network had declared war on America and and his family. Now they would learn what happened when America's most dangerous weapons were unleashed on domestic enemies. Chapter 6. The Hunter Becomes the Hunted. 3 days later, attorney Julio Simmons sat in his downtown Denver office, frantically shredding documents while his secretary fielded calls from increasingly nervous clients. The arrest of Kenneth Richmond had sent shockwaves through the legal community, and Simmons knew it was only a matter of time before the investigation reached him. What he didn't know was that Douglas Lacey was watching him from the building across the street, using military-grade surveillance equipment to monitor every phone call, every meeting, every desperate attempt to cover his tracks. Simmons's phone rang. Douglas listened as the attorney answered with barely concealed panic. "Simmons here." "Julio, it's Everett." The voice belonged to Everett Page, one of the network's key coordinators. "We need to meet. Now. Not over the phone. The warehouse on Bannock Street. 1 hour." The line went dead. Douglas smiled coldly. They were making exactly the mistakes he'd expected, abandoning communication security in favor of speed, choosing face-to-face meetings that could be monitored and recorded. Douglas packed his surveillance gear and made a call to Colonel Donnelly. "They're meeting tonight. Warehouse District, Bannock Street. I'll provide coordinates." "We'll have tactical teams standing by," Donnelly replied. "No," Douglas said firmly. "Let them meet. I want to see who else shows up. We're mapping the entire network tonight." Douglas arrived at the Warehouse District 30 minutes early, positioning himself with clear sight lines to the meeting location. The abandoned industrial area provided perfect cover for surveillance, while offering multiple escape routes if the situation went tactical. At 9:47 p.m., Julio Simmons arrived in his Mercedes, looking around nervously before entering the warehouse. Everett Page was already inside. Douglas had watched him arrive 20 minutes earlier. But they weren't alone. Judge Wayne Dudley emerged from a black SUV, followed by 2 men Douglas didn't recognize. Foreign operatives, based on their movement patterns and the way they scanned for threats. Douglas activated his recording equipment and settled in to listen. Through directional microphones, he heard fragments of panicked conversation. Richmond's talking to federal prosecutors. Need to eliminate the Stevens problem. Extract key personnel before. Then Judge Dudley's voice came through clearly. "The girl is a liability. She can identify our foreign contacts. We need her gone." Douglas felt his blood turn to ice. They were planning to kill Holly. "What about Douglas Lacey?" one of the foreign operatives asked with a slight Russian accent. "He's more dangerous than we anticipated," Everett Page replied. "Military intelligence is backing him. We may need to consider extreme measures." Douglas had heard enough. He activated his secure radio. "Donnelly, they're planning to eliminate Holly and Gregory tonight." "I'm going tactical." "Negative, Douglas. Wait for backup." Douglas was already moving. These people had just threatened his daughter's life. Military protocols were now secondary to parental protection. He approached the warehouse from the rear, using skills honed in hostile territory to penetrate their security undetected. The foreign operatives had posted 1 guard outside, but he was focused on vehicle approaches, not a single infiltrator. Douglas neutralized the guards silently, using techniques that ensured unconsciousness without permanent damage. He wasn't ready to kill American citizens, even traitors, without legal justification. But foreign operatives threatening his daughter fell into a different category entirely. Inside the warehouse, the conspirators were arguing about extraction timelines and elimination protocols. Douglas positioned himself in the shadows, close enough to record everything but far enough away to avoid detection. "The Russian wants confirmation before we proceed," one of the foreign operatives was saying. "Eliminating a federal witness and a child will bring significant attention." "The child isn't a federal witness," Judge Dudley replied coldly. "She's just a little girl who saw too much. Accidents happen." Douglas felt the familiar cold calculation of combat operations settling over him. These people weren't just traitors. They were planning to murder children to protect their conspiracy. The legal niceties were over. Douglas moved closer, photographing faces and recording conversations. He needed evidence that would stand up in federal court, but he also needed to understand the full scope of their plans. "What about Gregory Stevens?" Simmons asked. "He's already been handled," Everett Page replied. "Our people visited him this evening. He won't be testifying about anything." Douglas felt his world tilt. If they'd killed Gregory while he was here conducting surveillance, He activated his radio, whispering into the microphone. Emergency at Gregory Stevens' residence. Send tactical teams immediately. But even as he called for backup, Douglas knew he might be too late. He'd been so focused on mapping the network that he'd underestimated their willingness to move against witnesses immediately. The meeting in the warehouse was breaking up. The conspirators were scattering to implement their plans for eliminating loose ends. Douglas had to make a choice: follow them to gather more intelligence, or race to protect Holly. There was no choice at all. Douglas emerged from the shadows as the foreign operatives prepared to leave. His appearance was so sudden and silent that they didn't have time to react before he was among them. The first operative went down with a crushed windpipe, not fatal, but incapacitating. The second managed to draw a weapon before Douglas broke his arm and relieved him of the gun. Judge Dudley, Simmons, and Page watched in horror as a man they'd thought was safely contained demonstrated exactly why military special operations personnel were never truly defenseless. "Gentlemen," Douglas said conversationally, holding the confiscated weapon with casual competence, "we need to talk about my daughter." The three Americans looked at the unconscious foreign operatives, then at Douglas's calm, predatory expression. "Mr. Lacey," Judge Dudley said carefully, "there's been a misunderstanding." Douglas shot him in the leg. The sound echoed through the warehouse as the judge collapsed, screaming. Simmons and Page backed away in terror. "That was for planning to murder Holly," Douglas said calmly. "Now, who wants to tell me where Gregory Stevens is?" Through their panic and pain, the conspirators realized they were no longer dealing with someone constrained by legal procedures or moral qualms. They were facing a man who would do anything to protect his family, and their conspiracy had just become his personal war. Chapter 7. The Reckoning begins. Gregory Stevens was alive, but barely. Douglas found him in the basement of his mansion, beaten and unconscious but breathing. The visit from the network's enforcers had been intended as a warning, but Douglas could see it would have escalated to murder if he hadn't intervened at the warehouse. While EMTs worked on Gregory, Douglas coordinated with federal agents to round up the remaining conspirators. The recordings from the warehouse provided enough evidence for immediate arrests, and the two foreign operatives he'd captured were already providing information to avoid deportation to countries that wouldn't treat espionage failures kindly. But Douglas's personal mission was just beginning. Holly was safe at the Shea house, protected by a discreet federal security detail. Gregory would recover from his injuries. The legal machinery was grinding into motion to prosecute the entire network. Yet none of that satisfied the cold rage burning in Douglas's chest. These people had killed American soldiers, terrorized his family, and turned his own daughter against him. Legal justice wasn't sufficient for that level of betrayal. He sat in his study at 3 a.m., surrounded by files detailing the lives and vulnerabilities of every person who'd participated in the conspiracy. 12 attorneys, 6 city officials, 3 federal judges, and 23 businessmen who'd sold their country for money and influence. All of them were about to learn what happened when you declared war on someone who made warfare his profession. Douglas's secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Colonel Donnelly. All primary targets in federal custody. Network dismantled. Recommends standing down active operations. Douglas typed back, legal phase complete. Personal phase commencing. His phone rang immediately. "Douglas, whatever you're thinking, don't. The mission is over. You won. The mission is over when I say it's over, Todd. These people killed soldiers under my command and threatened my daughter. Legal prosecution isn't enough. Doug, you have Holly to think about. She needs her father, not a father in prison for vigilante justice." Douglas looked at a photograph of Holly on his desk, taken last week, showing her smiling for the first time since the trial. She was healing, finding her way back to trust and happiness. But the people who'd hurt her were going to comfortable federal prisons where they'd serve reduced sentences in exchange for cooperation. That wasn't justice. That was bureaucracy. Holly needs to know that betraying family and country has real consequences, Douglas said. Otherwise, she'll grow up in a world where evil succeeds as long as it's legal. Douglas, the conversation is over, Todd. Thank you for your assistance with the legal aspects. The rest is personal. Douglas ended the call and opened his laptop. Over the next hour, he sent encrypted messages to contacts throughout the military and intelligence communities, people who understood that some betrayals required responses beyond what courts could provide. By dawn, Douglas had a network of resources that rivaled anything the FBI could deploy. Former special operations personnel who'd retired to civilian life but retained their skills and contacts. Intelligence operatives who understood that protecting America sometimes required operating outside legal constraints. Military contractors who specialized in solving problems that didn't officially exist. The conspiracy had used legal and financial weapons against military families. Douglas was about to respond with tools they couldn't understand or defend against. His first target was attorney Julio Simmons. Simmons had been released on bail pending trial, confident that his legal connections would minimize any consequences. He was staying at his ranch outside Denver, protected by private security and monitoring his situation through expensive lawyers. What he didn't know was that Douglas had been studying him for weeks, mapping his routines, identifying his vulnerabilities, and planning exactly how to dismantle his life piece by piece. Douglas arrived at the ranch at sunset, moving through the terrain with skills honed in hostile environments. The private security was competent for civilian threats, but unprepared for someone with military training in infiltration and psychological warfare. He disabled the security system without triggering alarms, neutralized the guards with non-lethal techniques, and entered Simmons's study where the attorney was reviewing legal briefs for his upcoming trial. "Hello, Julio." Simmons spun around, knocking over his whiskey glass. "Lacey, how did you, the security?" "Your security was designed to stop criminals and protesters," Douglas said, settling into the chair across from Simmons's desk. "Not someone trained to infiltrate terrorist strongholds." Douglas placed a thick folder on the desk between them. "This contains detailed information about every crime you've committed over the past 4 years. Not just the espionage, everything. Tax evasion, bribery, witness intimidation, illegal campaign contributions." Simmons's face went pale as he flipped through the documents. "Where did you get this?" "That's not the important question, Julio. The important question is what I'm going to do with it." Douglas leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You see, the federal prosecutors only care about the espionage charges. They're willing to make deals, offer reduced sentences, maybe even witness protection if you cooperate. But I'm not a federal prosecutor. I'm a father whose daughter was threatened by a man who sold out his country for money." Douglas pulled out his phone and showed Simmons a video. It showed the attorney's adult son, Rich Simmons, accepting a briefcase full of cash from a known drug dealer outside his nightclub in Las Vegas. "Your son's been laundering money for Mexican cartels through his business ventures," Douglas said conversationally. "The DEA would be very interested in this evidence." "You leave my family out of this," Simmons snarled. "You involved my family when you planned to murder my daughter," Douglas replied coldly. "Now you get to understand what it feels like to have someone you love threatened by forces beyond your control." Douglas stood and walked to the window, looking out at the ranch's rolling landscape. "Here's what's going to happen, Julio. You're going to prison for espionage, but that's just the beginning. Your law license will be revoked. Your assets will be seized. Your son will be prosecuted for money laundering. But wait, there's more." Douglas continued with mock cheerfulness. "Your ex-wife Patricia will receive detailed information about the affairs you had during your marriage, giving her grounds to contest the divorce settlement and take half of whatever assets the federal government doesn't seize." Simmons was shaking now. "What do you want?" "I want you to understand that betraying your country and threatening my family has consequences that extend far beyond what any court can impose. You're going to spend the rest of your life watching everything you built crumble, knowing that it happened because you chose to side with America's enemies." Douglas walked toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and Julio, your cartel contacts in Mexico have been informed that you're cooperating with federal prosecutors. They tend to take a dim view of associates who might implicate them in ongoing investigations." "You're signing my death warrant," Simmons whispered. "No," Douglas replied. "You signed your own death warrant when you committed treason. I'm just making sure it gets delivered." As Douglas left the ranch, Simmons was already on the phone with his lawyers, trying desperately to find protection from enemies he'd made on multiple fronts. But Douglas had ensured that every potential refuge had been compromised, every legal maneuver anticipated and countered. Julio Simmons would spend whatever time he had left understanding exactly what Douglas wanted him to understand, that betraying America and threatening his family carried a price that no plea bargain could reduce. And Simmons was just the first payment on a debt that would take months to collect in full. Chapter 8. Justice Served Cold. 6 weeks later, the network's dismantling was complete from a legal perspective. Federal prosecutors had secured convictions or plea agreements from all 43 conspirators. Kenneth Richmond received life without parole for treason. Rose was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison with no possibility of early release. But legal justice was only the foundation for Douglas's larger project. Julio Simmons had been found dead in his federal detention cell, apparently murdered by inmates connected to the Mexican cartels he'd crossed. Judge Wayne Dudley was serving 15 years for espionage, but his son had been arrested for securities fraud in an investigation that mysteriously received detailed financial records from anonymous sources. Everett Page was in witness protection, but his protection detail couldn't prevent his business empire from collapsing under the weight of IRS investigations, civil lawsuits, and mysterious accidents at his corporate facilities. Douglas sat in his study, reviewing the status of each conspirator with the satisfaction of a mission commander watching objectives systematically achieved. None of them would ever threaten another military family. Most would spend their remaining years in poverty, isolation, or fear. Holly entered the study carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate, setting one on his desk before settling into her usual chair. At 13 now, she'd grown into a serious, thoughtful young woman who understood more about justice and consequences than most adults. "Daddy, can I ask you something?" "Always, sweetheart." "The people who hurt our family, are they all gone now?" Douglas considered his answer carefully. Holly knew some of what he'd done to ensure the conspirators faced consequences beyond prison sentences, but he'd shielded her from the darker details. "They can't hurt us anymore," he said. "And they can't hurt other military families either." "Good." Holly sipped her hot chocolate thoughtfully. "I know you did things that weren't exactly legal." Douglas felt a moment of parental concern. "Holly, I'm not criticizing you, Daddy. I'm thanking you." She met his eyes with an intensity that reminded him of himself. "They killed soldiers. They tried to kill me and Grandpa Gregory. They turned Mommy into a traitor. Prison wasn't enough." Douglas reached across the desk and took his daughter's hand. "Holly, I need you to understand something important. What I did was necessary, but it was also dangerous. Not just legally, but morally. When you fight monsters, you risk becoming one yourself." "Are you a monster, Daddy?" The question hung in the air between them. Douglas had asked himself the same thing many times over the past months as he'd systematically destroyed the lives of 43 people. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "I know that I protected my family and my country. I know that evil people faced consequences for their actions. But I also know that I crossed lines that most people would consider wrong." Holly squeezed his hand. "You're not a monster, Daddy. Monsters hurt innocent people. You only hurt people who deserved it." "How can you be so sure?" "Because you still worry about whether you're a monster. Real monsters don't care." Douglas felt a surge of pride and concern. His daughter had inherited his moral clarity along with his ruthlessness. That could be a powerful combination or a dangerous one, depending on how she chose to use it. "What about Mommy?" Holly asked quietly. It was the question Douglas had been dreading. Rose was serving her sentence in federal prison, and Holly had refused all contact with her mother since the trial. "What about her? Do you think she'll ever get out?" "Probably," Douglas said. "She'll be eligible for parole in 20 years if she maintains good behavior and continues cooperating with federal investigations." "Will you forgive her then?" Douglas looked at his daughter's face, seeing genuine curiosity rather than judgment. Holly wanted to understand how forgiveness worked in a world where betrayal carried such high stakes. "No," Douglas said simply. "I will never forgive your mother." "Why not?" "If she serves her time and says she's sorry." "Because forgiveness is for mistakes and accidents, Holly. What your mother did was a deliberate choice to betray her family and her country. She chose Kenneth Richmond over you and me. She chose money and comfort over loyalty and duty. She chose to help foreign enemies who killed American soldiers." Douglas paused, making sure Holly understood the gravity of what he was saying. "Those weren't mistakes, sweetheart. They were moral choices that revealed who your mother really was underneath the woman we thought we knew. You don't forgive someone for showing you their true character. What if she tries to contact me when I'm older? That's your choice to make. But I want you to understand that forgiveness doesn't require you to trust someone again. Your mother proved she's capable of betraying the people who love her most. That's not something time or apologies can change." Holly nodded slowly. "I understand, Daddy." Mommy chose to be the enemy. And we don't forgive enemies. Douglas felt a chill at his daughter's words, partly because they were so accurate and partly because they revealed how thoroughly the experience had shaped her worldview. Holly, I want you to promise me something. What? Promise me that you'll always choose loyalty over comfort, duty over convenience, and truth over what's easy. But also promise me that you'll remember mercy exists for people who make genuine mistakes. I promise, Daddy. But what about people who betray family? Douglas looked at his daughter's serious face and saw his own uncompromising nature reflected back at him. She would never be naive about human nature, never assume that love was enough to prevent betrayal. People who betray family, Douglas said quietly, don't get second chances. They get consequences. Outside, Denver glittered in the darkness, a city cleansed of a conspiracy that had operated in its shadows for years. 43 traders were paying prices that extended far beyond legal sentences. America was safer, military families were protected, and justice had been served through methods that no court would acknowledge. Douglas Lacey had completed his mission with ruthless efficiency, protecting his daughter and his country from enemies both foreign and domestic. He'd crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed and made choices that would define him for the rest of his life. But as he sat with Holly in their study, sharing hot chocolate and honest conversation, he knew he'd made the right choices. Some betrayals were unforgivable. Some enemies deserved destruction rather than mercy. And some fathers would do anything, absolutely anything, to protect their daughters from a world that contained people willing to sell their souls for money and power. The mission was complete. Justice was served. The war was won. And Douglas Lacey had proven once again that America's most dangerous weapons were never fully retired from service. Chapter 9. Legacy of Consequences. 2 years later, Douglas stood in the cemetery where Gregory Stevens was being laid to rest. His former father-in-law had died peacefully in his sleep, finally succumbing to health problems that had worsened since the beating he'd received from the conspiracy's enforcers. Holly, now 15, stood beside him in a black dress, holding a bouquet of flowers. She'd grown tall and serious, inheriting Douglas's steel-gray eyes and his uncompromising sense of justice. The trauma of her mother's betrayal had forged her into someone who understood that the world contained real evil and that good people sometimes had to make terrible choices to protect what mattered. Grandpa Gregory tried to do the right thing in the end, Holly said as they watched the coffin being lowered into the ground. He did, Douglas agreed. He chose family over the people who were threatening us. That counted for something. They were the only mourners. Gregory's business associates had distanced themselves after his connection to the espionage investigation became public. His country club friends had found excuses to avoid the funeral. Even his household staff had moved on to other employment. But Douglas had ensured Gregory didn't die alone or forgotten. He'd visited the old man regularly over the past 2 years, and they developed an understanding based on shared regret and mutual respect for Holly's well-being. What happens to his house? Holly asked. It goes to you. Gregory left everything to his granddaughter, with me as trustee until you're 21. Holly nodded thoughtfully. Good. I'll donate most of it to military family support organizations. People like us shouldn't have to face what we faced without help. Douglas felt a surge of pride at his daughter's instinctive generosity, balanced with satisfaction at her understanding of justice. She would never be naive about human nature, but she hadn't let bitterness poison her capacity for helping others. As they walked back to their car, Douglas's secure phone buzzed with a message from Colonel Donnelly. Rose Lacey requesting visitor privileges for family contact. Recommend denial. Douglas showed the message to Holly, who read it without expression. What do you think? He asked. I think Mommy made her choices, Holly replied calmly. Now she gets to live with the consequences. Douglas typed back to Donnelly. Request denied. No future contact attempts authorized. It was the 5th time Rose had tried to establish communication with Holly through official channels. Each request had been denied, and Douglas had made it clear to federal authorities that any attempts to pressure Holly into visiting her mother would result in legal action. Rose Stevens Lacey had chosen to betray her family and her country. The consequences of that choice included losing access to the daughter she tried to use as a weapon against her father. Daddy, Holly said as they drove home. Do you ever wonder if we're too hard? Too unforgiving? It was a question Douglas had wrestled with for 2 years. He destroyed 43 lives with methodical precision, showing no mercy for people who'd committed treason and threatened his family. Some nights, he wondered if he'd become the kind of person his younger self would have feared. "I think about it," he said honestly. "But then I remember what they did. They killed American soldiers. They tried to kill you and Grandpa Gregory. They turned your mother into a traitor and used her against me." Douglas paused at a red light and looked at his daughter. "Holly, mercy is a luxury we can afford with people who make mistakes. But the people who hurt our family didn't make mistakes. They made choices. Evil, deliberate choices that showed who they really were. And we don't forgive evil choices. We don't enable them by pretending forgiveness makes them go away. Evil exists, sweetheart. It's real, and it's dangerous, and it targets good people who think everyone can be redeemed." Holly nodded slowly. "So we protect good people by making sure evil people face consequences." "Exactly. That's what I've spent my life doing, and it's what you'll have to decide about for your own life." "What do you mean?" Douglas had been thinking about this conversation for months. Holly was 15 now, old enough to start considering her future and the kind of person she wanted to become. "You have choices ahead of you, Holly. You could choose to forget what happened to us, to pretend that betrayal and evil aren't real threats. You could focus on your own happiness and let other people worry about protecting society. Or you could choose to use what you've learned to protect other families from what we went through. You could become someone who stands between good people and the evil that wants to destroy them." Holly was quiet for several minutes as they drove through Denver's suburbs. Finally, she spoke. "I want to protect people, Daddy. But I also want to make sure that when evil people face consequences, those consequences are permanent." Douglas felt a chill of recognition. His daughter had inherited more than his appearance and intelligence. She'd inherited his capacity for ruthless justice. "That's a dangerous path, Holly. Once you start down it, there's no going back." "I know. But someone has to walk dangerous paths, or evil people will think they're safe." Douglas pulled into their driveway and turned off the engine. They sat in silence for a moment, father and daughter contemplating a future where Holly might follow in his footsteps as someone who protected the innocent by destroying the guilty. "If you choose that path," Douglas said finally, "I'll teach you everything I know. But I want you to understand the cost. You'll see and do things that will change you forever. You'll make enemies who will never stop hunting you. And you'll have to live with choices that other people will call evil. Will you think I'm evil if I make those choices?" Douglas looked at his daughter, really looked at her. She was 15 years old, but her eyes held the same cold calculation he recognized in his own mirror. The trauma of betrayal had forged her into someone capable of terrible necessary things. "No," he said quietly. "I'll think you're someone who refuses to let evil succeed because good people were too afraid or too weak to stop it." Holly smiled, and for a moment, she looked like the innocent child she'd been before learning that mothers could betray their families and that justice sometimes required brutality. "Then that's who I want to be, Daddy. Someone who makes sure evil people face consequences they can never escape." As they walked into their house, Douglas felt the complex mixture of pride and concern that came with recognizing himself in his child. Holly would grow up to be formidable, probably dangerous, certainly unforgiving of betrayal and evil. But she would also be someone who protected the innocent and ensured that predators faced consequences for their actions. In a world that contained people willing to sell out their country and murder children for money, that might be exactly what was needed. Douglas Lacey had raised a daughter who would never forgive enemies, never show mercy to traitors, and never allow evil to succeed through legal technicalities or social pressure. Some people would call that a tragedy. Douglas called it a legacy. The war was over, but the next generation of warriors was already preparing for battles yet to come. Evil would always exist, but it would face opponents who understood that some betrayals were unforgivable and some enemies deserved only destruction. In a world that often chose comfort over justice and politeness over protection, the Lacey family stood as a reminder that some people would always choose to fight darkness with light, even when that light came from the muzzle flash of justice, served cold and without mercy. The mission was complete. The legacy was secure. The war would continue. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.